The story of the Radium Girls is one of the most horrifying in recent history, yet it has been nearly forgotten today. What started as a fairly good job for a group of poor women, though, soon turned into a nightmare. This is the messed up truth about the Radium Girls. Radium was discovered in 1898, and it didn't take long for entrepreneurs to see the potential value in its luminescent properties. A few years after it was discovered, William J. Hammer mixed it with zinc sulfide and created a paint. While he didn't patent the invention, Tiffany & Company did. The new paint was wildly popular in Europe first, and the people who worked with it would glow as they walked through the streets at night. It wasn't until 1914 that radium-based luminescent paint started to be produced in the United States. By 1921, the main manufacturer had already expanded a few times and moved, changing their name to the United States Radium Corporation and patenting the name Undark for their paint. Other companies started popping up as well, using names like Luna and Marvlite for their paints. They weren't just making paints, they were using those paints too. US Radium hired scores of girls and young women, some as young as just 11 years old, to paint watch dials with the glow-in-the-dark radium-based paint. To make sure the dials got a good coating, the girls were encouraged to put the paintbrush between their lips and twirl it into a point. It was the best way to truly get precise numbers and brush strokes, but with each lick of the brush, they were swallowing radium, which we now know is radioactive. It wasn't long before US Radium was even getting military contracts to paint watches and instrument panels, and that meant more work for the girls. Unfortunately, that also meant more exposure to radium. The workers had been assured that the paint was harmless, so they often played games with the paint. It was common for the girls to paint their fingernails and teeth in order to enjoy the glow-in-the-dark properties.
Paint our faces up and put mustaches, and a couple of girls painted their ears.
Years later, Harvard physiologist Cecil Drinker did a study to see just how much radium the girls were actually covered in. He discovered that workers would be so covered with the paint and radium dust used everywhere in the plant that they would completely glow, and all along they were assured it was safe. It's worth noting that this wasn't just a case of a corrupt company telling their employees their working conditions were safe, at least not at first. Radium was thought to be super healthy. In fact, it was often marketed as a cure-all. The radium craze started in earnest in 1904 when L.D. Gardner began marketing a radium-infused health water he called Liquid Sunshine. Belief in radium's healthy benefits was rooted in a massive misstep in logic. Early experiments using radium to kill cancer cells had been a success. If it could kill cancer, the assumption was that it could kill whatever else was ailing you. Real doctors started experimenting with it as a cure for things like tuberculosis and lupus, while quacks started marketing their own so-called cures for everything from acne and baldness to impotence and insanity. People drank radium water and brushed their teeth with radium toothpaste, and radium cosmetics were all the rage. Children played with toys painted with radium, and performers on the New York stage danced and twirled in costumes that glowed. Radium was in such high demand that prices soared. By 1915, a single gram cost what would be around $1.9 million in today's money. Luckily for consumers, that meant many of the products didn't contain real radium. The Radium Girls weren't so lucky though. Very slowly, the workers began getting sick. Some started suffering from chronic exhaustion. For many, it started with their teeth. One by one, those teeth would start to decay and rot. When they were removed, their gums wouldn't heal. In some cases, the jaw would simply disintegrate at the dentist's touch. Bad breath was common. Skin became so delicate that the slightest touch would tear open wounds. Ulcers formed for some, and those that were pregnant bore stillborn babies. It was a variety of symptoms, and when the girls started looking for recompense, that became a huge problem. Attorneys for US Radium argued that with all of these different ailments, they couldn't possibly have the same underlying cause. Unfortunately, there's no way to tell just how many dial painters there were and how many died terrible, painful deaths. Of those we know about, many dial painters were typically in their 20s when they became really and truly ill. They were young women like Margaret Looney, who grew so weak her fiancé would pull her around in a wagon.
And when she got so bad and pulled her up to where we used to have the picnic, she couldn't walk, so he just put her in the wagon, away we went.
Bones crumbled, limbs were amputated, spines were crushed under their own weight. The girls became anemic, bedridden, unable to eat. The pain was constant, and in the late 1930s, enough were dead or dying that they got national attention. US Radium first tried to blame the girls' illness on an outbreak of syphilis, and it was years before the girls got their day in court. By that time, many testified from the same beds they would eventually die in, and they became known as the Society of the Living Dead. Companies didn't just try to blame the terrible illnesses on other causes, they absolutely took an active role in trying to cover up the truth. Margaret Looney was one of a family of 10 and would cover herself and her siblings with the radium paint. It took about 6 years for her to reach the end, and when she did finally collapse, she was at work when it happened. She was taken to a company hospital and her family was told she had been quarantined for diphtheria. She died in the hospital at just 24 years old. Her death was swept under the carpet, and it would come out later that doctors had been hired to find out what was wrong with the painters as early as 1925. Those doctors had assured Looney and her co-workers that they were perfectly healthy, despite all the evidence to the contrary. The lawsuit started in the mid-1920s, but it was shockingly difficult to even find an attorney to take the girls' case. Why? When radium painters sued US Radium in 1927, they were told they had passed the 2-year statute of limitations for complaints. They didn't testify until 1928, and months of delays prompted the newspapers to pick up the story. Those women accepted an out-of-court settlement, and when Ottawa-based painters from the Radium Dial Company tried to sue in 1935, they ran into the same problems. They, however, refused to settle. It was another 2 years before their case was heard in court, and by then Catherine Wolfe Donahue, one of the lead plaintiffs, had already collapsed at a previous hearing. She gave her testimony from her sickbed, and photos were plastered all over the country's newspapers. They won their case, but it was a hollow victory. The girls were often saddled with massive medical bills, and by the time medical bills and legal fees were paid, the Radium girls got next to nothing for their pain and suffering. Even those that won an annual stipend didn't get much since they didn't live long enough to collect. There was another byproduct of the trial. The girls who were part of the so-called Society of the Living Dead weren't aided by their community. They were shunned. Writer and historian Kate Moore says that in spite of the fact that these were young mothers, wives, and girls who were dying, the communities they lived in just didn't want to acknowledge what was happening to them. After talking to locals and reading countless documents, she found that it was an overwhelming belief that they just needed to be quiet about the whole thing. Why? The jobs paid very well at a time when work was scarce. It was the Great Depression after all, and locals were afraid that if the Radium girls won their case, that work would go away. Not all of the Radium girls died young, but those who did survive struggled with predictably awful health issues. Take May Keene, who died in 2014 at the admirable age of 107. She was hired on as a dial painter in 1924. Fortunately for her, though, she didn't like it. When she was taught how to point the brush with her lips, she was revolted by the taste of the radium paint. Keene said she only worked there for a few days when she was called into the office and asked if she would like to quit. She said yes. However, over the course of her life, she suffered from chronic health problems, including ones that sound eerily similar to those suffered by the girls who died: bad teeth and migraines, and 2 diagnoses of cancer. As it turns out, dying women and some guilty verdicts couldn't stop the radium paint industry. Catherine Donahue weighed less than 60 pounds when she died before Radium Dial finished appealing their case before the Supreme Court. In 1934, their president, Joseph Kelly, was kicked out of the company, but Radium Dial wouldn't be the last company he opened. After Radium Dial went out of business, Kelly simply moved to a building down the road and reopened as Luminous Processes. He hired a workforce from among the girls who had been put out of work when Radium Dial closed, and he kept them painting for a long time. It wasn't until 1976 that Luminous was fined by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. That commission found that Luminous had been exposing their workers to radiation levels 1,666 times higher than regulations allowed. Assets were shuffled, Luminous closed, and the lawsuits that continued into the 1980s went largely unpaid. The Radium girls weren't just sick, they were very literally radioactive. Molly McGeough was exhumed in 1927 in the hopes that her bones would give still-living Radium girls the evidence they needed to win in court. Reportedly, when her coffin was lifted out of the ground, her body actually glowed. That wasn't entirely surprising, considering her bones were found to be highly radioactive. Ottawa, Illinois was known as Death City throughout the 1930s. In 1987, the documentary Radium City tried to show just how long-lasting the effects were, in a very graphic way. When one man headed into the Catholic cemetery where many of the Radium girls were buried, the Geiger counter he carried goes nuts. Their remains, 6 feet down, are still radioactive. With some of the girls, precautions were even taken. Margaret Looney and Catherine Donahue were buried in lead-lined coffins. And yes, devotees of radium-based health products are just as radioactive. Industrialist and golfer Eben Byers was the poster child for a drink called Radiothor, and drank several bottles of it a day. Holes formed in his skull, his jaw fell off, and his bones began to crumble. He died in 1932 and was so radioactive that he was also buried in a lead-lined coffin. If you think the legacy of the Radium Girls ended when the companies using radium-based paint closed, you'd be sorely mistaken. After Radium Dial closed, the building was converted into a meatpacking plant. After the meatpacking plant closed, it became a farmer's co-op, and it was finally torn down in 1968. The rubble was used as fill around the city of Ottawa. The building that housed Luminous didn't fare much better. For years after the plant closed, it was also used for storing meat. Eventually, 16 separate sites around Ottawa would become classified as Superfund sites, requiring long-term intensive hazardous waste removal. NPR Illinois says that many have been cleaned up, but as of 2018, there was at least one site that still remained a highly radioactive and terrifying legacy of the Radium Girls. Check out one of our newest videos right here. Plus, even more grunge videos about your favorite stuff are coming soon. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit the bell so you don't miss a single one.